Okay, this is MC1 Gamer. Hello, everybody. I wanted to do a video on tournament structure, Age of Sigmar, and not entirely about comp. I'm not looking to rip into comp. Obviously, anybody who follows me probably knows pretty well that I think less comp is more. I think that there's a lot of effort to overdo comp in Age of Sigmar, more so than is needed. But I'm looking to propose some concepts when it comes to event structure. Because I'm involved with the Gamer Grunts, and we're organizing a variety of events around some of the local shops in the tri-state area, and we're looking to grow it, and we're looking to eventually make a GT, and we want to do something that's a little bit different from the same old steamroller type events that are heavily comped to try and create some artificial balance that Age of Sigmar really isn't about. So I wanted to propose my ideas. If any of you guys are watching this live and you have questions or comments, or if you're looking to go and propose anything after the fact on the video, please feel free to contribute. Opinions are welcome as long as they're not anti-AoS. If you're not into Age of Sigmar, go away. If you are interested in Age of Sigmar and you want to see what it's about, more than just a rehashing of the same old type of tournament structure that we saw in 8th edition and previous editions, and the same that we've seen in a lot of the tournaments, large and small organizations that are out there. If you want to see something different, then this is what I'm looking to talk about. Now, let me try to kind of back up and tell you a little bit about my philosophy. First of all, the philosophy for the Gamer Grunts is really to try and go as comp light as possible. Now, there's a few of us involved. There's Nelson and Joe and myself, and there's a few other people. And we're not just talking about Age of Sigmar. We're talking about many different games. But right now, the core of what we're starting with is Age of Sigmar, because there's a few of us that are pretty passionate about it. And there's really been just the same old theme as far as the events that we've seen talked about, and it just seems like there's a million different comps. But the idea is really to go as comp light as possible, to provide the freedom and flexibility that Age of Sigmar is built on, to allow people to play the models that they want to play, the units that they want to play, and not be overly inhibited to things like 0 to 2 heroes, 0 to 2 monsters, 0 to 2 war machines. Whether it's built on things like wounds or scrolls or some mathematical calculation that you need to have you need to have a master's degree in statistics, or you need to be a professional in trigonometry or calculus. Some of these things are just too much. And I think that for the every person, especially for the young player, the simplest comp is the best type. So that freedom is what I'm looking to kind of plant my flag around. Now, that's not to say that there aren't different types of things that I want to put into place that are going to reward and in some cases penalize players for trying to play something that is a little bit more, not balanced, but a little bit more fair, not crazy. Trying to rein in the crazy is some of what we want to deal with, because you don't want somebody coming in with a truckload of miniatures, plopping it down where there's not even any room other than the bases for all their minis that they have, and going against somebody that may have just a starter box. That's, can Age of Sigmar be played that way? Absolutely, and it can be played in a fun way that way. But more often than not, it's not going to be, because that's just an over-exaggeration of what imbalance can do, and something that we've seen plenty. The don't be a dick comp is the best comp, but you're not going to see that in tournaments and in organized events quite often. So, like in many things, you kind of need to legislate the effort and guide players, and still provide the freedom if people want to go out of those bounds, but reward people that are going to try and create lists that are not over the top crazy. If somebody wants to bring Archaean onto the table, if they want to put Nagash onto the table, and if they want them to have a list, like I just saw recently, I was engaged in a conversation on one of the Age of Sigmar Facebook pages, and the guy brought a reasonably balanced list, and he played Stormcast Eternals, and it wasn't that crazy of a list. It was a good list, and he went up against twice Nagash. And Nagash seems to be one of those, even before Archaean came to the table, just one of those polarizing, concepts. This character that is so powerful, has tremendous capabilities, can wipe off characters with the wave of his hand, but he's killable. And that's what I think a lot of people aren't seeing, that some of these powerful characters are killable, but their presence on the battlefield changes the game. This particular list was like 300 skeletons and zombies, Nagash, maybe a couple other things. I don't remember exactly because I didn't see the list, but I saw the picture of it. I don't even know if he had a zombie dragon or a coven throne or anything. I think it was just tons of summonables, tons of large units of these one type of creature, and very little diversity in the Gash. So it was a very skewed list. It didn't have the depth and the complexity. So I'm looking to try and when I told the player, who he somewhat was lamenting about it, he wasn't really complaining or whining, but I said, that's not, because he had made a comment that this event needed more comp. My argument is I don't think the event needed more comp. I think the event needed more scenario structure. Let that player bring what he wants to bring. If that's what he wants to bring, maybe that's all he owns, or maybe that's the kind of army he likes to play. But create a scenario structure that would reward people for having cav units, because there's a scenario element that does that. For having a diverse set of infantry, rather than just one monstrous unit of one type of infantry, the best in that particular scroll list. Reward theme armies. If you have the same keyword throughout your entire army, that's going to be a reward. Maybe you get a victory point bonus for that. Reward players who have flyers in addition to these other things. I know some lists don't have that, like for instance, ogres don't have it. But the idea of providing that freedom. If you want to have 12 giants, great, have 12 giants. That would be fucking great to see on the table. But there's going to be a disadvantage to that. You don't have any casting, you don't have any shooting. If the scenario requires you to do certain things, you're not going to have that. But can you play that? Sure. If little Timmy wants to buy 12 giants or 6 dragons and put it on the table, fine. Do that. Let that player do that. Have all the flexibility in the world and have that fun. They're going to miss out on some of the victory points. That's what I'm looking to instill and have that mindset. And I'm hoping that this kind of spreads, and maybe there's some grassroots effort to try and encourage TOs to look outside of the standard steamroller effect. So here's some of my thoughts. I'm going to go and put this up over here, and I've titled it. It's a long title, but this is a draft I've been working on a while, and this is things that I'm proposing to Gamer Grunts as well for our events. I might run this on the 1 or 2 event locations that I'm kind of taking the lead on in terms of running, and we'll see what happens. So the long title in this draft, I've been working this a while, by the way, but with a lot of the efforts that have gone into recently, creating the circuit with Gamer Grunts, I'm bringing this out not just for us. This is not necessarily what is going to be instilled into any of these events. It's a possibility, but also, throwing it out to you, to the community, and hopefully people will see it and it'll resonate with some, even if it's just an event or a game in the event, something different to throw out there in the spirit of what Age of Sigmar is about, and hopefully it'll open up some eyes. And the reason why also is because I think that a lot of players need to be weaned off of that steamroller effect, that only line up in battle, that only killing units, that only just taking and holding objectives, that there's where there's no narrative, there's no real scenario involved that's different, and I'm not really imposing anything that's so radical. But I still see some of the same stuff, and I see that in a lot of the comps that I see. I applaud a lot of the people that really go out of their way to create a very buttoned up and very nice product in their comp. I mean, like a Zero comp. Chris does a really nice job in making it look very professional. But again, it is a restrictive comp, and it's a mathematical type of a thing. And I don't think the 7, 10, or 15-year-olds that are going to bring the stuff that they want to bring are going to look at the depth of these things and necessarily be able to, some of these calculations and some of these things are a little ridiculous. So, and not everybody wants to walk into an event with a calculated list. Some people just don't know any different because that's all what some of these events do. So if you don't have any other experience, then you don't know any differently. So and the idea, of course, is to be able to deploy on the fly, bring your collection, whatever. But maybe you're not going to deploy everything. Certainly shouldn't, because some scenarios are going to kill you for it. But that's it. So let me get into it. So the idea, the title that I put up there, again, it's a $25 handle, is Ideas for a Non-Standard, Non-Steamroll, and Scenario-Based Narrative-Driven Games for Gamer Grunts Events, Age of Sigmar. So yeah, the idea, again, is what I've been saying. That's just the a little more in one breath, if you could say it, title. So let's go through it. So instead of imposing wounds or unit caps, the intent is to allow player freedom and flexibility of what they wish to bring and play, and with each game for the event. So again, each game is going to be different. You might not, you'll bring whatever you want to play, but you might not deploy everything you bring, and you might not deploy it certainly in the same, there may be different tweaks depending on what the scenarios are. Now, it could be a situation where you post the scenarios in advance, so people could have a preparation for their list or what they think they'll deploy in advance. That's a nice idea. I like the idea of a blind situation too. Put it out there and there's a strategy involved in the deployment phase in Age of Sigmar that I think a lot of people are losing when they have pre-generated lists. But even if you have pre-generated lists, if you like that, if your player base likes that, that's not necessarily such a bad thing either, because when you deploy with the base rules of Age of Sigmar, things are going to change as people deploy, depending on what the terrain is. You may not know, you may know what the scenario is, but you may not know what the terrain is until you get to the table. And that terrain can change a lot of things too. And the scenario may give you an idea of what you would want to bring for the scenario. But if you deploy Age of Sigmar the way the core 4-page rules dictate, then you're going to change that up as your opponent is deploying things and as you see things unfold on the table. Things like sudden death, which I'll get into because there's some ideas on sudden death that I have as well, can change a substantial amount of things that will incent you to try to finish deploying early. And if you are the second person finishing deployment, maybe you don't want to overdo it because you will then enact a sudden death for your opponent. So those are types of things that really need to be considered in any game, whether it's in an event for an organized event, or whether it's just your casual games. Beyond just the basic of don't be a dick comp, which doesn't mean don't ever bring Nagash or Arcane. It means, try to have a friendly, fun idea of what a game is for both sides, as opposed to just trying to pound your opponent into submission and into the dust. And you'll both walk away with a more fun experience. So my concept is these games, and this is something that Nelson brought out in our video earlier this week, which is try to play the scenario first, and then think about what you're doing when your opponent is on the table as well. The scenario is what you should be really looking at, because you're probably going to get more victory points in the scenario, as opposed to just beating your opponent down and trying to table them. So the concept then, moving to the next thing, is I want to list I want to try to design something that rewards players for diverse armies instead of imposing penalties. And though some penalties do exist in some situations, and what that means is that there'll be some blanket bonuses for all games, and they'll grant victory points if they apply. And some of these will be situational for certain games. And they may be random tables or assigned to a scenario. They may be different for each game. They may be different at each event. And the exact victory point values I'm not going to get into right now, because that's still to be determined. So this is really kind of an early draft on this. But you can see how this will work if you just follow with me. So some of the basic blanket victory point situations, and not all of these need to be in existence, but these are some of the ones that I've come up with. Things like, let's try to guide players into having a reasonably deep array of unit types, so that they don't just bring in one unit of, again, 300 skeletons, and that's that one unit. All right, because there's nothing that says in the core rules that you can't do that. Why not? If you could have 15 gyrocopters, it's one unit, it's one deployment, but it's a little crazy. And while again, the freedom and flexibility I want to keep at, I do want to establish that we need to have we want to have an array of stuff on the table. You want to have 6 dragons? Fine. Each of those is an individual deployment. I want to try and guide people to bringing that diversity. And maybe they're new to the game and they don't have the full flexibility of this stuff, but then they're going to lose victory points. So the idea is that if you have 8 individual deployed units of any type, okay, any number of wounds, any number of type, but they have to be at least 8 deployments on the table. That means, and there's a reason for that when it comes to some of the scenarios, which I'll go into later, but it gives you at least a minimum of what you are going to bring to the table, where there's a strategy of what you're putting down. You're not putting down just one massive mega unit. And let's put a maximum on that of 15. Now, again, the hard fast rule is, and again, I'm going to probably repeat this a million times, is if you're a little bit below, if you're a little bit above, it just means that you're not going to qualify for that victory point bonus, that victory point slot that you would then check off at the end of each of your games. And then again, some TOs might want to instill this and say this is a guaranteed, very specific requirement, and that might be an idea as well, that could be one of those hard and fast rules. Another thing that I would put in there is, anything that's not classified as a character, a monster, a war machine, but is under 20 wounds gains the victory point bonus. One of these bonuses are, again, this is something that I'm working out, but the idea is that we want to reward people. We're not going to have those massive, 30, 30 I think is okay, but the 300 is what I mean. Wound units. If they're going to have more diverse units that are not so crazy, and they don't over deploy these massive armies that are too huge in their unit sizes, they'll cede, if they want to do this, some of those victory points to their opponents. And you'll see how some of this comes into play further down. Okay, real big contentious point is summoning. Because if you have however you structure your event, however this game is, whether it's a casual game or if it's a tournament event, summoning can overbalance things because you're bringing all this stuff onto the table that was not on the table initially. Well, I don't agree with that, and I don't agree with the whole idea that every game has to be balanced either. But if you're going to summon like crazy and bring in so many more models, you are providing your opponent with an option to destroy more stuff. And in the standard victory conditions, the percentages balance that out when it comes to who won. So if I summon 100% more of my models and my opponent defeats, I'm going to have more option because I'm going to have more power to destroy my opponent because I have more on the table. More options, more power means that I have more attacks, more shooting, more things I can kill, more wounds than I'm doing. So as a result, I'm going to probably kill more. But then I have more stuff that's going to kill versus my starting block. That percentage could price me right out of any victory in a standard game. But I want to make that even further. In an organized event, look, in a friendly game, I don't think that it's as much of a problem. But and some people might argue that point because then there's no gauge, there's no limits on anything. People could just go hog wild. But in a friendly game, I think you know who your opponent is, or you should, or you're getting to know your opponent if it's a pickup game, and you should have an idea of how not to go too nuts unless you talk to your opponent first and you're both on the same page. You should have a dialogue before you put stuff on the table in a friendly, casual, organized event type of setting. In an organized event, we need to know what some of these things are. And I think that the overzealousness of summoning with some armies can get out of control. And I play a summoning army. My main army is undead, probably the most obscene of all the summoning armies. So regardless of how you view any of this, I think it would be nice to impose a victory point benefit to people who are not summoning or versus people who are, because you're getting an inherent benefit because of the mechanic. So the way I'm looking at it is if you summon, beyond the fact that you're providing more options for your opponent to kill things, you're getting a benefit on having more on the table for you to kill their stuff. So you are seeding some victory points based on what you summon. Now, the mechanic I'm still working on, but it could be something along the lines of victory points, whatever that number might be, based on every 10 or maybe every 20 wounds that you summon onto the table. Understanding that not every wound is equal. I get that. But some kind of mechanic that says if you summon, you're providing more power onto the table, but you're also in an organized event setting, in a tournament setting, you're giving up some semblance of victory points because of the conditions to your opponent as a result. What that does is it means that you as the summoner have to strategically think, when am I going to summon? How much am I going to summon? Is this the right opportunity to unload that because I'm going to achieve a certain aim? Is there a victory condition? Is there a scenario objective? Is there something in that game where I am going to summon in order to achieve that? Or am I just looking to pad up my army to kill my opponent more? And if that's all you're doing, you're going to lose because you're going to be giving away victory points as a result. There's going to be an accelerator in place that's going to make that a decision that you have to make. And if you're not making it and thinking about it appropriately, you're going to lose the game as far as the victory conditions are concerned. That's what I want to instill. Give the opportunity to the players. Do not neuter them and say, you can't do this, but create a climate where it says, if you do it and you do it out of control and you do it without a result in mind, you're giving something away. You still may win. You still may summon Hog Wild and put out a whole entire new army on the table, or pad with additional units, or grow your units like crazy, like you could do with zombies. But there's going to be something that you're giving up as a result in the format of the organized event for that game. So, and stay with me with this, because a lot of this stuff will become more apparent further down the line as I go through some of these bullets. Okay, so and with that in mind, the victory conditions in the end result, when you're adding up points, are still going to apply. So if I summon an extra 50 skeletons and 50 zombies, that's an extra 100 things on the table that I've brought in that might have died, that could also, just in terms of what my opponent can kill, might provide them with even more victory points. So let's revisit that in a second. Okay, so I already mentioned this when I'm going to read, but this is something that I think is a really good one, because I want to encourage the creation of themed armies. I think one of the things that we've seen in years past, even in crazy steamroller type events where it's all about crushing, there was a lot of creativity in the painting aspect, in the hobby aspect, in the converting aspect, which was theme armies. So in order to encourage theme armies, providing a victory point bonus, all right, for achieving entirely an army under one common keyword. So yes, you could potentially bring in an army which has, demon flamers and, ogre bulls, ogre iron guts, for example, and dwarven, iron drakes, and a dragon from high elves all over the map. Okay, a bunch of stuff from a lot of different lists. But Age of Sigmar is not as much about factions as it is about war scrolls. And we're going to see this further and further as we see more releases over the course of the next year or two and beyond, that the old army lists, yes, you can still play them. They're not going away. Those PDFs aren't getting deleted from your database. You can play the old models, even if they suddenly stop being built. They don't necessarily get sold anymore if they go out of print. You can still play that stuff forever. There's not going to be a situation where somebody's going to say, you can't play those old models. The PDFs exist. And if ever that happens, I can't foresee it. But I just don't see why they would do that. But the idea is that if you want to play a themed army, you'll get a benefit. Why not? If you're going to stay all within order, if you're going to stay all within death or whatever, if you have only fire slayers in your army, that's one keyword, then you should gain a benefit in terms of victory points as a result. I think that would encourage people to at least check off that box and say, I'm just going to play undead. I'm just going to play my elves, or if maybe they're mixing elves with Bretonnians. Who knows? Whatever it might be, encourage and try to guide people to try to build these with a reasonable carrot, a system that rewards people that stay within those lines, but doesn't restrict people who want to go outside them. You want to go outside them and you're willing to give up that victory point a cachet, do it. It's not going to lose you the event, but you're taking the risk of falling further down the ranks because you're not gaining that benefit. I like that mechanic. I hope other people do, and that's going to be a theme as I go through this. Another one is, and I don't want to see people not being able to bring models they bought and painted, like Nagash or Arcan or Scarbrand or others. Let people do that. Somebody wants to bring that War Mammoth onto the table, bring it. Bring it. Put it down there. You bought it. You painted it. It's a legal model. There's a war scroll for it. Fine. Put it on there. But I would like to incent or incentivize. I don't know which is the proper grammar. I'm sure somebody will post that in the notes in the details down below. But if you want to put something in where we want to put these superpowers in, fine. But if you want to try to create an army because you would like to not play that, or maybe you don't own it, you could gain a victory point benefit if you have no characters that are above 12 wounds. 12 wounds is pretty substantial. I think a lot of the monster-ridden special characters kind of cap out at 12 wounds, and then when you get beyond that, well, they don't cap out, but the regular ones, the more rooted and grounded and not crazy ones. But once you get beyond that, now that's when you're talking about crazy power. And I'm not denying Nagash, Arcan, they are on the top of the heap in terms of what is, and we're going to see more of them as more factions, as more lists, as more war scrolls are developed. We're going to see more stuff like that, and those are crazy powers that those guys have. I think it would be, if you want to put it out there, fine. Your opponent, if he or she doesn't have that, they'll get a victory point bonus as a result. Let's see some other ones. Let's see a war scroll that let's see. Okay, I'm looking at my bullets and they're kind of being organized in a different fashion. Okay, so here's a really big one. Having a diverse set of, and I mentioned this a little bit, having a diverse set of unit types. So you're not all infantry. You're not all, monster cav. So let's see if we can check off some boxes here. If you have a flyer, a unit, victory point bonus. You have cav. If you have infantry, victory point bonus. If you have all of one type, you don't get it. Okay? If that way you don't have, again, a situation where it's Nagash and 300 zombies. Because you want to have some diversity. Now, this isn't just some way to guide people. You can't just say this and then have people follow through with it. Sure, some people will. But the scenarios, and I'll get to that later, have to reward players for having these diverse sets of armies, for having an array of different unit types. So, because somebody could come in with just heroes. They're not going to do that well. They may hurt your opponent. They may do some fairly well, but there's going to be some things that they're not going to be able to do. And I think that's important because I don't want just somebody coming in just with all monsters and rolling through everybody. But we want to create scenarios where the scenarios themselves reward people for having diverse unit types, because there'll be objectives and things that need to be accomplished that can only be done if you have a reasonable array of different unit types. So if somebody wants to come in, however, with 12 giants, wonderful, do it. But you're going to be having an uphill battle when it comes to certain scenarios, and you're going to see certain victory conditions because you don't have certain unit types in that checkbox. Okay, so that's something that I like as well. I don't think that the bonuses can be duplicated in this. So, for instance, if you have a unit that is a infantry unit and it is a flyer, it has a flying component. You're not, in other words, and I'm not really describing this properly, but you're not going to be able to double dip with one unit. One unit can achieve the checkbox for one of these categories. You can't achieve for multiples because some units can shoot as well as do other things and have different mobile elements. We want to make sure that you have each individual unit only qualifying for one of these. So multi-purpose units are not going to qualify for both. You have to have another unit that applies to that. So that's what I'm proposing. Okay, you have to declare which it applies for. You'll need another unit to accommodate the next one. I think one of the biggest things that I'm looking for is no predetermined lists. Deployment is a really important part of Age of Sigmar. The strategy of deploying, I mentioned this already, as per the core rules. So placing units in an alternating fashion and halting at any point and deciding that you're done is a tactic. You've put your stuff on the board and you may have ruined the intention of your opponent to put down a certain spread, a certain combination of units. This is a tactic. It actually harkens to how, again, it's a fantasy game, and it's a game. It's not real war. But if you try to think about the idea of a general deploying his or her units and having an idea of how they want to do so and being able to counter your opponent, this is just an element that kind of, in some way, duplicates that or emulates it. It's not perfect. It's not real world. It is a game, but it does have some impact on how that game is played. There's a strategy involved in the deployment phase. And I think a lot of comp systems or standard steamroller events just kill that. They crush that concept right out of existence. So I like the idea of that no to predetermined list. If you as a player want to bring in a predetermined list, that's fine. But There's going to be a lot of situations where you're probably going to come out of of your strategy, because you're going to need to, when you see the deployment phase in front of you, your opponent deploying something, you may want to counter that because the situation dictates it in real time. And that is I think that is a fabulous element in Age of Sigmar we don't see in many other games. And I don't want to lose that. I want to emphasize that as much as possible. So as a result, first to complete deployment gains an element of victory points. They gain a bonus. Again, what that is, we'll go through it another time. But there is a need for rewarding people that are deploying with a tactic, with strategy. They may have their list in front of them. They suddenly, when they see the situation unfold, they're going to stop. Now, what does this mean? Could sudden death be instituted as a result? Fine, it could be, but maybe the situation doesn't involve sudden death. I like the idea of providing a victory point bonus to the outnumbered player if they've achieved what would normally be a sudden death, which is usually a third more, or is it 30%? I forget already. If your opponent then over deploys, once they hit that value, suddenly you would be ceding victory points to the outnumbered opponent. I think that would be a way to, in an organized event structure, provide incentives for people not to over deploy. So not only is the person who has the smaller amount gaining victory points for stopping first, gaining the first turn for stopping first, but if you over deploy as a result, because you want to try and crush them with numbers, you're now giving even more victory points to your opponent. So in this organized event setting, that provides incentive not to do that. Can you do it? Sure. You want to have fun doing that? You can. We're not going to stop you. All right. Some other things. Let's see. Special goofy abilities that are not required to be done, but they're encouraged. They don't have to be acted out to gain those special abilities. So certain things, like for instance, where these abilities should be considered to be active and usable. You don't have to go and make a fool of yourself if you don't want to. But if you do, have fun with it. But I'm sure after like the 10th time of saying to the lady, you're going to get sick of it. But certain ones where it's not obvious, you just don't need to do it. Manfred doesn't need to talk back to you, but hey, I would love to put it in a situation where there's victory points given for somebody who actually puts a voice box somewhere within the model or near the model and actually has a little conversation with Manfred. That would be hysterical. But apart from that, you don't need to kneel. You don't need to toast to the lady constantly. You don't need to do these things. Certain things where, it's not obvious, like whose beard is more impressive, I think it should just be obvious. If it isn't, call a TO over, have them make a judgment call. You're just going to have to accept that if you're a dwarf player. If you're playing somebody who's not a dwarf player and they've got a beard down to their belly button, well, you don't get that ability. I'm sorry. But those are ones that are not, you don't have to do, a song and a dance. Next one, measuring base to base. I personally like measuring model to model. I think it works. I didn't think so at first. I was way against this. When I first started putting out these videos and I said, I'm going to unlock Age of Sigmar, I said, this is ludicrous. It's a crazy idea. I put out a video, go find it, where I was doing overlapping and overhanging models, and it was silly. But I decided before I was going to try and suggest changes to Age of Sigmar, and I thought I would have millions. I thought I would have tons of suggestions on how to change Age of Sigmar. I probably could have gone down the road of being the hyper uber comper, but I decided I was going to play this game as pure as possible to the rules first before I'd make changes. And what amazingly I found is after, I can't even count how many games. I mean, there have been dozens of games I played of Age of Sigmar. And the more I played, the more I realized this stuff just works. Just put aside, all the craziness and all the advantages and, people who are trying to cheat. If you're just putting it into just if you're just using the rules as they are, they work. They really do. Give it a shot. But a lot of people never get a chance because people who either organize events or in their clubs, they've just decided this is the way they want to play, and they want to try and harken back to either previous editions or whatnot. But I will say this about measuring base to base. It does eliminate some of the people who kind of gauge an extra inch, an angle of where they're measuring from. It could be anything that slows down the game, I'm against. The idea of having to walk to the other side or come over and double measure because the other guy measured and maybe he was doing it from a weird angle or something. Anything that can stop the game or halt the game, I think takes away from the fun. And in an organized event, timing is an issue. You're going to have a time limit. So, I mean, if it's your own event, you have all night long, you have 5 hours to play one game, you don't care. But in an organized event, you're going to probably be playing, in most cases, 3 games and maybe more, depending on what the ultimate situation is. So you want to have some kind of thing that equalizes things. And as much as I don't like base-to-base measuring, base-to-base probably helps most in the organized events. I would like to see more people do model-to-model, but if you really need to go base-to-base, fine. I'm willing to cede on some of these issues that I feel very strongly about too. And I think that there's been a case made towards base-to-base. I personally will play model-to-model. I think there is an entire strategy based on how big a model is, what their footprint is, if it's small or large, on the table. And I encourage, please, people, play this game as purely as possible before you try to comp things out. You have a large model where it has has wings, it has tails, whatever, it has a long tongue or whatever. That stuff balances out as close as you might be to somebody else because of those extra pieces on your model. That's the same distance they are to you in terms of shooting and charging and being able to attack you back. And in some cases, it's an inhibitor. It's an inhibitor because you may be looking to fly around the table and you have to stop within 3 inches of an enemy model. So if they have cluster models or if they strategically place models in certain ways, they could prevent large footprint models with large bases, or not even large bases, large wingspans, and just be the bigger centerpiece models from moving to different parts of the board or getting away if they want to retreat. That is a tactic. It is a strategy in the game. You should use it. Don't crush it out of existence. And the smaller models will have a greater chance of being able to maneuver into and out of these clusters. So there is a merit to be had in terms of the measuring model to model. But it's cleaner in an organized sense, and I agree with that, to just leave it to base. What that does create is a scenario where you're going to have, and we all know that there's going to be one, douchebag out there that's going to do it. If it's you, don't do this. Who's going to basically, try to pile up his models on top of his own models and gain advantage, or pile them up on yours. It's not a thing, guys. Just because one demo guy from the GW store did it, or did it at an event when Age of Sigmar came out, doesn't mean that that's the rule. I think it's kind of silly that people have gone out of their way to promote some silly rule about stacking bases when it's just not a thing. It's ludicrous. It's never been a thing, and just because bases aren't implemented in Age of Sigmar in its core rule structure doesn't mean that you have to start stacking bases and maybe even destroying somebody's hard work in terms of their scenic base. But if we're going to measure base to base, it kind of eliminates that ludicrousness, and it makes it easier to measure things. But what it also can do, that same person that's probably stacking the base is probably the same person that's going to put a squig on a zombie dragon base, on a 150 by 100 base. And I got to tell you, that's the kind of thing that we should be looking out for. I think if there's any kind of guesswork or judgment on something like that, you need to go to a TO, and that TO needs to disqualify that model. And if it's grossly abused, that person should get disqualified from the event. I mean, if they're bringing a whole unit of things that are on ridiculously disproportionate bases, the bases should be reasonably close to the structure of the model, the torso structure of the model. And if you're not going to do model to model, you need to be reasonably accommodating in that regard. If it's a ogre bull, you could put an ogre bull on the equivalent of a 25 mil. But it's probably going to fall over a lot too. So it's something that you should think about as well, because if he's on a hill, he's going to fall over. Why? Because I put mine on these, I think they're on like 25 mil fenders washers, kept on falling over. I'm moving them over to 40 mil rounds, the round metal washers. I use the metal washers because all of my transports have lined that adhesive magnetic strip pages that I put down on it, so that when I use the metal fender washers, they just stick for transport. Not getting on a plane with these things, but you put them in a car, it's very unlikely things are going to tip over or get all disorganized. They're going to stick to that adhesed magnetic paper. That's how I do it. But even so, if you put them on a small base, when they get to the table, they're going to tip. So it's going to work against you as well. Either way, be responsible. If you move to base, do not put gigantic models on teeny tiny bases. Do not put teeny tiny models on gigantic bases. They should be reasonable, but they don't have to be uniform. If you decide that your tree man who's standing up vertical is going to be on a 50 mil base as opposed to the elongated one that's probably twice as long but about a third thinner, that's fine. I did that. It's going to give you certain advantages or certain disadvantages when it comes to measuring base to base. That's something that you're going to have to accept as well if you're going to do base to base. They're not obscenely out of proportion in terms of their base to model ratio, but they're going to have different footprints and different abilities on the table. Subtle, but they're there. All right. Summoning. God, this is a long and involved thing. I should do a video just on it. The standard for Age of Sigmar, despite what some people feel, is that they are war scrolls, not army books. You have a war scroll, that's where the rules are. It says it in the core rules. The rules are on the war scroll. So if the rule is that on a war scroll, it gives, if you have a wizard who is in an army that has a summoning mechanic, but the spell is not on the wizard war scroll, he doesn't have it. Just because your unit of skeletons is sitting in the closet doesn't mean your necromancer can suddenly summon that guy. You need to deploy that unit in order to create the ability to summon that unit. It says it on the war scroll for skeletons. When you deploy it, it unlocks it. The skeletons are there on the table, or if there's a scenario mechanic that makes you put them to the side because they're ambushing or they're in reinforcements because of a scenario structure, that's fine. They're part of what you're deployed, whether it's outside the board, on the side table, or on the board. They're part of your deployment structure. They have an impact on the game. But they're sitting in your case, or if they're at the home, I mean, when does it stop? They don't have an impact on summoning. So let's stop with all the silliness and the rules lawyering about summoning. People thinking that this is an army book. If there was an army book, they would release the PDFs as army books. They would have released the hardcovers as specific army books. There are collections of war scrolls. You could have one unit. It has one set of rules. That is the rule. So the summoning is going to be, as I propose, and certainly in the events that we're doing at Gamer Grunts, this is how we philosophize it, is that the war scroll unlocks the ability to summon that unit. If you do not deploy that unit as part of deployment in some fashion, you do not have the ability in that game to summon that unit. If you do, you can summon more of them. Then you could go into your box or your transport and pull out as many skeletons as you want in future summonings or whatever that unit is. But you need to establish that that spell is now usable by all your death wizards. There is a caveat to that, and I know this is getting into a whole debate. And when this hangout is more about something else. There are some that break this rule. There are some, specifically in Chaos, where it says on the wizard war scroll there is a summoning spell. That guy can summon more of him or her. That model, that unit, can summon more of itself. There is a mechanic built into that war scroll that allows it to summon another of its kind. I think it's the Tzeentch Greater Demon. Yeah, you can do that. It's on the war scroll. There should be no question about that. It's very powerful. It could certainly get away from you. That's something that is going to be allowed, and I think it should be allowed. But there are tripwires to rein in some of the crazy. So let's talk about what some of those are. Okay. Let's see. I have a bunch of scenario specific. Let's see. Let's go through. Let's see what I missed here. I got the summoning out of the way. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to some of the scenario specific things I'm proposing. These are bullets that will come into play where to create challenges for each event, challenges for each game in the event, and they might not show up at every event. They might not show up certainly in every game. They could be randomized or they could be imposed as specifically part of a scenario. So here's some of the things that could change things up that may just throw a wrench into your strategy, but they're going to change the different winds of events that really are going to have to make you think outside the box. And I think these are important things to really separate really good tacticians from others, because you don't want to otherwise we're just lining up and fighting, and that gets a little boring in general, even if it's in your regular casual game. We want to try and create some challenges for people. So there may be there may be random tables or situations where these things are enacted. It depends. But here are some of the ones that I am throwing out there, and I'm always willing to hear of others. There could be a situation where all shooting for that game is at a -1. Could be, stormy, a stormy season. There's heavy rains and clouds and thunder. You can't see where you can't shoot out what you can't see, and if you try to, you're gonna miss more often than not. So there's one. There could be the winds of magic could be against you. There could be a +2 penalty cost in all casting. So add +2 onto the casting value that you have to achieve onto all casting. That's a nice one. That kind of could change things a little bit. You never know when it's going to come into play. Maybe something that you know about in advance, maybe something that you roll up when you get to the table. There could be a chart. I like that. Get people out of their comfort zones, change things up a little bit. You never know when it's a huge advantage for you or a huge disadvantage or for your opponent. It really helps in certain events. I like to see where, like, for instance, flyers suddenly are a -2 or a -4 movement. Flyers can be really fast, and they are devastating in that a lot of times flyers can shoot. Either way, if there's a situation where flyers maybe in that particular game can't move as far, you better think about what you're going to do. Same thing with shooting. Maybe shooting ranges change. Maybe it's not a minus to shooting. Maybe instead, or in conjunction with that, I wouldn't want to double dip on that, but maybe there's a thing where you don't have a penalty on shooting, but the shooting ranges are different. Why is this important? It requires you to put shooting units maybe into greater danger at certain points. Should this be a blanket thing in all cases? No. Certain games are going to have these. Certain games are not. Not all games are going to have all of these. Not all games are going to have any of these. You have to. That's the kind of thing where I think we would change up these elements to make it uncertain when they're going to occur, and have people have to rise to the occasion and deal with uncertain adversarial events. And the people that are able to adapt the best are going to be the ones that are going to do the best. But it creates at least a challenge, a hurdle. Some other ones. All spells may have changed in range. Not that the unbinding is different, although I do like the idea of a longer unbinding range, just to give the ability to counter some of the default automatic casting costs that some of these spells have, because there are things that stack that make your 8 casting costs suddenly it's a 4. But let's just throw these out there, and I'll get to the next series here. Maybe roll Rens are suddenly +1. If the things don't have Ren, they become a Ren 1. If they're a 1, they become a 2. Something like that can make the game much more devastating and could have a huge impact on heavily armored troops as opposed to the non-armored troops. Maybe for one game, all running is 2d6 instead of 1d6. Not movement, running. Running, there's nothing more crushing than wanting to run a unit, but then you can't shoot, you can't do certain things, and then rolling a 1. You roll 1 more inch. That could have an impact. That could be really good for you, but you only rolled a 1. You sacrificed all of that. You got 1 extra inch. It kind of sucks. But that's the game, and it's the risk, and it's the randomness that kind of makes this thing ludicrous and fun, and you have to laugh at it. But what if there was an event where you're on a paved road, or this is a level field? It's not, maybe it makes running a lot easier. So you could get further across the table to objectives, or maybe do an end run around an opponent if you have to get off to the table edge of your opponent. Those types of things can have an impact. And I like the idea of occasionally seeing running be a lot more effective. Maybe charges are all +1. Maybe the ability to charge in is more effective. All bravery values could either be +2 or -2. You never know what that's going to be. That could really have an impact. Obviously, 10's the maximum, but what if everything's at -2? That's going to hurt those 10 units. What if everything's at +2? 10 is the cap. All of those non-demon, non-undead units that are at 10s suddenly have a boom. That's a big deal. I'd like to see that be randomly instituted. How about failure to cast a spell means that unit automatically takes a mortal wound without any saves of any kind? I love this. Really think about what you're casting. Make sure that if you want to take a risk of that casting cost of 9 or 10 to summon in a greater demon, you fail that, you take a mortal wound. That's a big deal. That could add up. What if you have multiple spells that you can cast and you keep failing them? Suddenly Nagash is down to 9 wounds. And he's much more killable than before. You have to think about these things. I like the idea of having to make decisions with the benefit and the penalty. There's some kind of offset, but you never know when these things are going to come into play. And they wouldn't be at every game. How about really making in one game, all models, whatever they are, If they're a single model and they have greater than 12 wounds, they take a wound per turn, mortal wound, no save, which stops at 12, of course. But they start getting diminished. Who knows? There's a swarm of, warp stone tipped, stingers on these bees that are hovering around our can, and they're really bugging him. And they feed off of him, and then once he gets to 12 wounds, well, they're satiated and they go off. Just a way to encourage people maybe not to take the crazy stuff. You never know when that thing's going to pop up. Is it going to be guaranteed? No, but if it shows up, you're going to wish that you had taken some more standard generic characters or uber hyper powered, super powered characters. And again, it shouldn't be all the time. Should not be all the time, but I'd like to see that sometimes thrown in there, because maybe in the deployment phase, that person might say, okay, well, I guess I'm not putting him out. And maybe it's a surprise. Maybe it happens after deployment that you roll up on these random tables. These are some of the things I'd like to see us do with Gamer Grunts, and I'd like to see more people try to institute into their events. Okay, going further. Let's see. Here's a big one. A lot of people have complained about people, gamers hiding casters in the very back of their deployment zone, behind a rock where they can't be seen, and casting spells where there's no way to unbind them, or sitting an engineer next to a war machine that's in the very far corner. Maybe there's unstable ground underneath them. There's earthquakes, tectonic activity, volcanoes, and it's at a certain region of the table. Well, I'd love to see randomly put in there all heroes, mind you, just heroes, take 1 wound if they reside at the end of their turn within 6 inches of your deployment edge, your table edge, not the sides. What that means is you can't pad up or hide or sit in the back, for that game. Again, for that game, all of your special, uber characters, you might have to move some of these guys forward. If there are cannons in place, hey, cannons can move. Move the cannons up. Get out of that 6-inch deployment range. You're in greater threat range for shooters, for attackers. You might have to move off of a hill. If you're willing to take that risk, fine. But that's the kind of thing I'd like to see. That engineer's going to have to make a choice now. Is that engineer going to sit there with that shaky ground? Not all the time this is going to come into play, but I'd like to see it. It would make somebody have to make choices. All right, here's one that I would like to see just thrown out there every once in a while. How about after deployment, each player has the option of vetoing 1 unit on the table. You've deployed, you're out there, a unit up to maximum of 20 wounds, which means it could be 1 big character or 1, modest unit. If somebody has a unit of 300 skeletons, you're not going to kick that off the board. But let's say it's up to 20 wounds in that unit. They can say, I elect, maybe their scouts disrupted that unit from getting to the table. You deployed it in the game structure, but in the game itself, they've managed to find some way to befuddle that unit and delay them from the game. But in doing so, you're ceding to the person who had to remove that unit victory points. So this is, again, a situation where both of them could do it, or one might do it and the other one might say, I'll take the victory points. They're starting the game with a few units down, with a few models down, a unit down, a character down, but they've gotten a victory point benefit. And it wasn't that they chose it, their opponent chose it. It may suck if that one huge centerpiece character is the one that's removed, but you're going to get a victory point bonus out of it. And it should be enough that losing that is at least reasonably favorable. Maybe not be as favorable as having that monstrous character on the table, but you're going to get some kind of benefit out of that. Not every game. Once in a while, seeing that and seeing how that plays out, we'll see how that works. I like to see that instituted in some random games. Okay, next one. Here's a great one. Again, so many people have this ire about summoning, and they don't look at how to try and combat it, how to defeat it. Same thing with shooting. But I don't want to legislate these things into submission where you can't summon. But I would like to occasionally have situational hurdles for people who use these things, because it may win you one game, but then the next game the conditions might change. You've got to think outside the box. So what about an option for summoning spells that build up counters? And in tokens in a turn. So the first time you cast a spell, you've added a counter. No inhibitions on that first spell, but now you have the second spell, not from one guy, from your entire magic phase, from your command phase when you cast spells. Not command spell abilities, I'm talking spells. So if you have 6 wizards or 8 wizards, every time you cast from whoever you're casting, and then you have to strategically plan who you want to cast early and who you want to cast later and what spells you want to cast early and later based on these modifiers. Every time you cast a spell, the next time you try to cast in your turn, you have an additional counter. That counter is making it 1 higher in order to cast. Okay, so if it was normally a 7 to cast, now it becomes an 8. And the next time the next guy tries to cast something on your side in that turn, in that phase, rather, now it's a +2. Maybe it's a cheaper cost. Maybe that was only a 4 because you have some modifiers. You're next to a piece of terrain that gives you a +1, whatever that might be. But whatever that situation is, it's now at a +2. You have to start thinking now, who's going to cast when and what? And am I going to give up and stop it at one point, at some point? If obviously it's going to fail. Now you couple that occasionally with the idea that if you fail at casting, you might take a mortal wound on that wizard. You're going to start really considering whether or not you're going to be casting. Again, please let me emphasize this. I know I'm a broken record. Not every game, not every event. Let's just see some of these things come into play that throw people off their regular game and have to think outside the box and think on the fly. Okay. I've seen this on many events. 1 monster on the table, if we can have it, if we have the models for it, that has a rule structure of how it works, that randomly moves, that might charge if it's able to, whatever it's in range, or shoot at the nearest model or something like that. And if you as a player decide that you want to engage it, it might take you away from the scenario objectives, but you'll get victory points for killing the creature, but you might take losses. And you might actually be diverting troops away from resources away from achieving your own objectives, but also maybe stopping your opponent from achieving theirs. So that's something that I'd love to see. I like to see secret objectives. Secret objectives that your opponent doesn't even know you're about to achieve, that you could, sandbag a little bit at the very end of a game and be able to achieve, and they wouldn't even know to go and stop you. Then you flip over a card, that was one of your secret objectives. That's another one I'd like to see. I'd like to see more scenarios with imbalance built in, like the Watchtower one from the first book, where there's a unit sitting in a structure, and a lot of their entire rest of their forces is not even deployed. They have to get onto the table, and the person trying to take the Watchtower has an advantage. Now there are mechanics built in that equalize this, and this has been a very fun scenario to play. I think it's a lot better than 8th edition's Watchtower. This Watchtower in Age of Sigmar is more interesting, and it's more balanced insofar as it's an imbalanced situation where the army structures are imbalanced. But I think it's balanced in the scenario insofar as there are benefits that you get, bonus command abilities that you get being the defender or the attacker, that make it more interesting and bring in a lot of strategy into that particular game, that scenario. Where in the previous version in 8th edition, Watchtower either completely killed you if you were like Bretonnians and you had an all cav army, or whoever was in the Watchtower had a huge advantage because of the building rules. So I would like to see more games that provide a scenario structure that take things and really just twist them up and shake them a little bit, where the balance of armies is not what's being considered. Some of your armies need to deploy separately or differently, or not even on the table initially, and the scenario rewards you a little bit for that, and may penalize the other person for the fact that they have much more resources to start with. Here's a scenario. This is a sample scenario. I use this example all the time. The Last Stand of the 300. It's one of the examples I use to explain to people why Age of Sigmar Imbalance gives you so much more in the narrative sense, in the linked scenarios over the course of several quicker games that a lot of competitive events, I think, are crushing out of with their comps and with just regurgitating the same old from the tournament circuit. And not everybody's doing this, but I see more often than not that they are. That's why I sound so critical. So if you're not doing it, nothing against you. And even if you are, if your players like that, more power to them and more power to you. If people are enjoying it, that's fine. But I like to see some things that are a little more outside the box. And I use this as an example of why Age of Sigmar doesn't need to be balanced. You don't need this hyper-mathematical formula, with the hypothetical cosmic connections, the cycle revelation, the ultramarine blue, where you trying to formulate some kind of mathematical thing that you need to be some kind of a genius to figure out. in order to first walk into the, just put shit on the table and see whether your checklist of what you've accommodated in terms of victory points and whether you win, and use your strategy based on that. But just bring your box and put it on the table. You could be a 12-year-old kid or a 10-year-old kid and not be a math major, or math genius. But you have a bunch of models and you want to put them on the table. You don't want to have to build the list with all this stuff. That's what I don't want to have happen. But let me just throw out the scenario. Completely imbalanced type of a game. I've been talking about this last stand of the 300. Historically, without giving a friggin' history lesson again, this was 300 Spartans and about 8,000 levies, Greek levies from the surrounding area. And they went up against not 1 million, 250,000 roughly is what people guess, Persians. And they had incredible defensive structure. There was a whole naval battle too. We're not going to get into it. And they were able to hold off them because they were defending a thin pass. And they had the right armor, the right battle plan, and your opponents did not. And the opponents had numbers, but they only could put in a small group of numbers in a small segment. And it really so favored the defenders that that they were able to hold them off. And they eventually lost and died. Hey, I'm sorry, spoiler alert. But don't see the movie; it sucks. But but even so, the idea is that you had a hugely outnumbered force achieve a strategic victory in a battle that was part of a larger campaign. And that is what I want to try to instill into people, whether it's your regular casual games or whether it's the actual tournament structure. The idea of needing to have two balanced sides is not necessary. You do not need to do that to have a fun game and to have a competitive game. We've all been, force-fed that with the tournament structure as it's been up until now. Just legacy tournament games are only about that. And some people try to break outside that, I understand. But most of it is just, let's find some point structure and create as equal sides as possible. And boom, let's line up and fight. Let's try to think more in a narrative sense. Let's try to take some history, where there's never been a battle ever created that was equal sides, okay? You're not talking about two guys in a ring. We're talking about war. If we're trying to emulate a game of war, even in a fantasy environment, let's try to create them in a scenario that makes sense and is interesting. So in that regard, you might have a army list that's outmatched by another, but there is elements in that scenario that will make it interesting and fun, a challenge for the defenders, a challenge for the outnumbered, and some hurdles for the person that's got the advantage in terms of numbers or power on the table. Here's a scenario, just an idea off the top of my head that I've kind of had floating around that I wanted to use. All right, so each player rolls for who goes first. This is the last stand of the 300. We're not talking about the actual Spartans here, but let's just use this as inspiration. The winner chooses to attack or defend. That's their choice. They won the roll. They may prefer to be the guy with the huge army. The defender has to deploy on one side of the table. The long side, where the thinner sides is where you're going to be deploying. It gives the attacker more room that they have to traverse to get to the well-defended terrain. The defender, that's where the bulk of the terrain is arrayed too. The really well-defended positions. It could be an array of buildings. It could be a tree line. It could be hills. It could be a pass, like in Thermopylae. The bottom line is that it's something that's favorable to the defenders. They have all the cover. They have benefits of cover. Maybe there's something that's instituted in the rule, where if all the defenders on that last foot of the board always get +1 cover. Who knows? This is the concept, however. All right. Let's see. Deployment is alternating, but the defender only deploys every other time onto the table. The times that they don't get to deploy onto the table, they take that unit and put them to the side. So the defender has to make a choice. Am I deploying that unit on the table, or am I going to leave that unit in reserve, or reinforcements to bring in at a later point? So they're going to have roughly about half as many units on the table. Are those units large numbers of shooters, or large numbers of infantry, or maybe a small number of monstrous cavalry or flyers? Who knows? That's for the defender to decide. That's their decision to make. But they're going to have to deploy roughly half of their units on the table, half their units off the table. So they're going to have a numeric disadvantage. And there's no guarantee that all of their units that are in reinforcements are going to make it on the table. So if they make that choice, they may not get those guys to come in ever. I mean, likely that they're going to come in, but there's always a chance that they won't. So Your attacker is going to have huge numerical superiority in the first part of the game. Okay, the ambushers and scouts on either side still can come into place, or your attackers may have some units that may get up right in their grill really early, and even your defenders might be able to do that if they have reinforcements that have that ability. They can then use it. So if you have a really smart person that uses a lot of ambushing type units, they may be able to skirt some of this and get more stuff onto the table, or some of their deployed stuff in their defending zone could try to slow down and hamper the advance of your opponent, sacrificing maybe a whole unit of miners, for example. Miners, not minors. Talking about dwarves, who can ambush. They have this great ability to like scout up and kind of pop out of the ground. You have a unit of 20 of them and you throw them up in front of your opponent, they're not going to be able to march past you. They can't. Their movement is hampered because they've got to stop within 3 inches. If they have flyers, they can pop over. If they have enough movement, they can move around. But they're also going to have to be concerned with the fact that there's a unit right up in their grill early in the game. That's going to slow them down. Why is this important? Because, well, first off, in successive turns, starting in turn 1, before the command phase, the defender is going to be rolling a die 6 for each unit that's not been deployed. All right, and only on a 6 or more is that unit then going to be able to be deployed. All right, so the first turn, if no 6s are rolled, none of these reinforcements are made it yet. The second turn, it's going to be +2, so it's going to be a 5 or 5+, all the way up until the last turn where they might not even really matter. Probably will, because the attacker is making their way all the way across the battlefield. Okay, so. But it's a greater chance. There's a good chance you could get with a good rolling, a lot of these units within the first couple of turns. But there's also a good chance that they might not really have an impact later. So you're going to be outnumbered. But that's the point of this. You're outnumbered, not balanced. Okay? Let's see. So with that in mind, okay, units that come on the board can be deployed anywhere next to the table edge and then have a normal move in. So the defenders can get reinforcements in to kind of help them, to replace some of their losses from shooting or from any combat that's taken place in the early part of the game. And then they can replace some of them. Still, they have the defenses. They have the best terrain. They have cover modifiers. They could be slowing the person down. What's the caveat to this? That's the accelerant on this that's going to also benefit the defender and be something that the attacker is going to have to overcome. Every turn after the first that the defender, I would say maybe even from the turn 2 on, and it's going to be an ever-increasing amount, the defender gets victory points, bonus victory points, because they have held the defensive ground. Now, this could be part of a string of games, part of a scenario that you play on your own. But in a competitive game, in a tournament, an organized event, this could be a really interesting thing on how to kind of get outside your comfort zone and really overcome the challenge and have to think on your feet and deploy on your feet and have a good array of models available, so that you need to put stuff into this fray, dealing with this scenario intelligently, and how you do that will impact how well you do. Maybe your army selection might have an impact. You have a lot of options with the dwarves, with stationary objects that can shoot and destroy things at good range. But you know what? Maybe some of them are not going to be starting out in the early parts of the game. Either way, victory points are going to benefit the defender for being able to survive, and the attacker will have the benefit of, if they can get across the board, not just across the board, maybe we institute where if they can get off the board edge, they get a unit of fast movers, and they can get off the opposite board edge. They have an incentive to get across the battlefield, not just to stop the enemy from getting bonus victory points for each unit that's still in play, but also to achieve some really good quality, valuable victory points if there are enough of an incentive to get maybe some units in the latter part of the game off the board before they get decimated themselves. This changes things up. It's not, I mean, look, this is nothing so radically new. But we've taken a basic structure for Age of Sigmar and we've instituted a complete imbalance, okay? A complete imbalance, and we've created a scenario where there's a benefit and a disadvantage to both sides and hurdles and obstacles for them to overcome. And it's an interesting story, whether it's, again, your personal game, a casual game that you're playing, and this is part of an overall arc where you're emulating the Battle of Thermopylae and the whole, Persian, war against the Greeks. You may have a whole series of things like this that come up. Maybe the next game, the sides are flipped. Who knows? But in the organized event sense, this could be something that could really have to make people change up how they play. And then the real masters are the ones who overcome them properly. Then I would like to institute, putting that aside, this is an example, guys, of a scenario that I would institute that might be a joy to play, hugely fun. And it could even be multiplayer, by the way, but is not your standard lineups. Let's all meet in the middle or swoop around the sides and just kill each other and add up the points. All right, and I know a lot of people are very creative with this. There's a lot of tournaments that are steamroller tournaments that have really interesting scenarios. I applaud them for that as well, but I want to try and think outside the steamroller mentality, where everything has to be even as much as possible from the starting gate, because that's an illusion already, right from the get-go. If you think that everything is already balanced just because you have points or some comp system, no game is like that. No game is perfect. They're all going to have little, benefits, and it's all within the gameplay too. But the starting block of what's in those army books are not always going to be balanced. All right, so let's talk about some specialty games that I'd like to institute and what I'm thinking of for gamer grunts. I want to have some specialty games, like King of the Hill type games. I love this stuff. And if you happen to have the model and you're part of the event, and there's going to be surprise support for a lot of these things. And a lot of this stuff is going to be hashed out, guys. These are things that I'm talking about with my colleagues, and we're going to be tweaking some of this stuff. Some of this stuff may get thrown to the wayside. Some of it may get adjusted and adapted and implemented. So I'm just throwing it out to you as ideas and concepts, whether you're a tournament organizer, whether you are going to tournaments and you want to talk to a tournament organizer and say, hey, let's try to institute some of these ideas. I hope I'm inspiring people in some small way if they're not already thinking of these things and more. And I'd love to hear ideas from people as well, because you never know. I haven't thought of something. But in any case, let's talk about King of the Hill. I would love to have mega battles where, look, I have a Nagash. I have the guys that I'm working with, Nelson and Joe, and others. There are multiple Nagashes. There are multiple Archaeans. There's going to be more models coming out that are absolutely hugely superpowered on the level. I call them the gods of, not the gods, the superheroes of Age of Sigmar. Those are the superpowers. Those single models that are just crazy. They dominate the table in some way. They can be killed, by the way. They can all be killed. Stop with saying, oh, they're invincible and trying to comp them out of your games. Bring them in there, but give them obstacles to overcome. But I want to create, apart from all this, a mega battle. Bring your big bad boy onto the table. Again, Archaean, Nagash, any other superpowered models that are released down the road. I want to be able to have a King of the Hill where any model that's, let's say, excuse me, up to 22 wounds, because that's the max wounds we know about so far. That's the War Mammoth, which I would love to have. I may have to customize one of my own. But in any case, that one model, bring your one model. We're going to have a battle royale, last man standing with prize support for whoever wins, maybe for whoever has the first kill. That's the first thing. Then we'll have a mid-tier one, anything up to 9 wounds. So you can bring your Tyrians or your old Archaean, not on the 3-headed dragon. Bring in a really good hero, that single model. Maybe he's on a mount, maybe he's on foot, whatever. No summoning on these, by the way. No summoning mechanics. But any other spells apply. Any other special abilities apply. And let's have a battle royale, last man standing, King of the Hill, whatever you want to call it. So 2 tiers, one for the not-so-superpowers and one for the really ridiculous ones. I want to have games like that, and I'm going to be instituting that in as many events as possible. The next one is going to be other specialty games, which is going to be a mega battle. Just like a lot of us have Nagash or Archaean, I want to have games where, and these are not necessarily within the framework of the tournament, 3 games, who has the most victory points achieved, and then ranking from there. We're talking about Nagash with an army of undead, huge army of undead, excuse me, Archaean with a huge army of chaos or whatever, and having 4 to 8 players, bringing, say, let's just throw spawning 50 wounds of models each. So you could have one centerpiece model, one major monstrous, you'd have just 4 monsters. You could do that. You could have 48 wounds, 4 giants, 4 dragons, whatever. You could do that. You can bring that. Bring up to this amount of whatever you want. Okay? It could be a necromancer and 49 zombies. And that guy could just be like summoning zombies. And soon he has 200 zombies. And that's what he's doing. Whatever you want to do. But we'll have 4 to 8 players on the table against an army of guys and a centerpiece mega model. And we'll battle it out. and we'll see, you know, we'll have fun like that. That could be an entire day event, by the way. But this could be something that we would be instituting in, say, a GT, which will be a multiple day event. For single day events, I doubt we'll see something like this. This is what I want to play. I have enough undead to do this just by myself. And Nelson and Joe, who are part of Gamer Grunts, and these guys have more than I do because they have multiple armies. I don't know if any one of their armies is as big as my biggest, but they have many armies. I have 5 armies now, but the 4 secondaries are far smaller. But I could start building those up to the point where they could be combined, and maybe one of those, one of those devastating singular models might be one of those things in the future. Maybe there'll be the dwarven golem, or there could be a gigantic, human, free people's singular model that might come into play. Who knows? But we'll be doing some of these things, I'm sure, and in different ways. And I would like to have several tables where multiple players are fighting against one huge, massive army. And then lastly, I want to talk about, painting. We know that there's, painting competitions and awards for painting. We're not obviously instituting things like you need to have everything painted, but there'll be awards for people who do. I'd like to see the same thing for conversions. They may be part of the whole painting thing, but as we expand, we'll be doing conversions. This is the framework of the kind of event I would like to see. We already have a comp type system. It's very light, but it's a rule structure currently in place. But here is the kind of concept we may start instituting, everything I've talked about so far, or you may want to take inspiration from yourself and pose or propose on local events. I hope you do. And if you have ideas, throw them at me, throw them at us, and we'll certainly talk about them. I know that Paul Conti recently, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name properly, threw out some concepts. I think that there's maybe a little too much math in it, but he does propose some nice ideas. But we're going to be looking at tweaking this stuff as we go. We haven't even started the first event yet, but we're going to hopefully be running several. We have about 3 or 4 on the calendar already, and at 3 different venues. And I think that venue list could go to 5 very shortly. We're already looking through towards April and May now for the calendar. So there's going to be a lot of changes to this, and we're going to see what works and what doesn't. And I hope that you guys will take a look at it if you're in the local area. And as we grow, who knows? Maybe we'll have people traveling from different places to kind of join our events. But we're going to have fun doing it, and it's going to be really cool. And I hope that if you are part of this circuit, or if you're creating your own series of events or doing your own making your own tournaments, that if you've gathered any of this information, or if we've maybe taken some inspiration from some of the stuff that you do, I just think that. I hope that everybody, of course, has a good time. That's the most important thing. But I want to see, Age of Sigmar grow. I want to see it played in a much more free-form way as opposed to being constricted or constrained. And I want some creativity to be used in how it's played, as opposed to trying to put it back on rails, and restricted with what you can't. You can't bring too many giants. You can't bring too many monsters. Oh, too many heroes. Too many war machines, the finger wagging from, come on. Let's try to give the freedom back to the players. That's what Age of Sigmar was about. That's what I'm trying to propose. You may agree, you may not. Doesn't matter. If you do, wonderful. And if you don't, you're right. But either way, have fun and have a great day.